Mr. Chair and members, many years ago, the legislature recognized possible issues that can arise between farm operators that create unavoidable noise and odor, and their neighbors needed to live without unreasonable conditions. In the past, we've tried to remedy this through statute and the Pollution Control Agency rules by setting standards for noise and odor. The state, by setting these standards, has given direction to farmers on what they need to be doing to address these concerns. And it's, if the farmer is meeting those obligations, they should not be subject to lawsuits for these issues. I would like to turn it over to my two testifiers, obviously in the interest of time, to let them explain what we're trying to do here today. Obviously, with the amendment, I would turn it over to Mr. Perry, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, if I can give a short handout here.
Sure, we'll have a staff assist there. And sir, if you could state your name for the record and proceed.
Mr. Chair, Jack Perry from the Briggs & Morgan Law Firm, and in the interest of time, there's a handout that goes through the 4 points of my justifications for these amendments. And the starting point to understand these amendments is 1997. That's the 1997, the DFL passed what I consider, and based on historical research, a compromise bill to address the issue of odor feedlots and the impact on neighbors. And what the legislature did was basically came up with three different components of this compromise. The first one is that the legislature recognized that during the manure removal process in the fall of the year, basically mid-October, there is a time period when there is no way you can keep the odor levels under the state standards, which had already been passed. And so they passed a 21-day removal exemption from the state standards. The second thing that the legislature did was the legislature recognized that while livestock odor has a whole slew of different air emissions components, they singled out the most dominant one, the one that is most clearly attached to the offensive odor that people sense, and that's hydrogen sulfide. And so they made an express correlation between livestock odor and hydrogen sulfide levels. And the third thing they did was they restricted and directed the MPCA to monitor and respond to complaints, and said to the MPCA, and I know they're in the audience here, Galen Reitz is over in the corner here, they said you can take enforcement action on any action, civil, criminal, whatever action, the full menu is before you to address livestock odor issues, but only if there is a violation of these hydrogen sulfide standards. In other words, this was a recognition that the operators, such as the man on the right, Mr. Fitzsimmons, these feedlots can't operate unless they can have the protection that they're not going to be sued or closed down by the agency, any other local government, or neighbors by whatever suits are brought during the removal time period, and if they're in compliance with the state standards. For the last 18 years, from 1997 till recently, that's the way it has played out. That's my point number two, or excuse me, point number, paragraph number 2 on page number 1. And in fact, the system has worked. And for facilities such as one that I represented a few years ago, Mr. Reitz came in and said, you guys got to come in compliance. They couldn't do it, and they were shut down. The system works. Point number 2 on page number 2 is we now face a threat where we're going back in time. And the Humane Society of the United States and some others have brought nuisance claims and other claims. And the claims essentially are trying to undo this compromise that was reached back in 1997. And specifically, what they're saying is the exemption during the fall, during the removal period, that only applies if the MPCA is taking regulatory actions against these feedlots. If you're a neighbor and they're in exceedance during that exemption period, you can bring your lawsuit and you can shut them down. And based on other laws, you could easily shut down a facility. You cannot operate if that exemption doesn't apply. Second thing they said is these regulatory standards, they don't mean anything. They only mean something if the PCA comes after Mr. Fitzsimmons. Otherwise, they're irrelevant. Well, That's fine unless you have a multi-million-dollar facility and you're trying to get investors to invest in it and trying to operate. It just doesn't work. But that's the stance that is these different plaintiffs groups and national groups have taken, and we are fighting those in different fronts, several different fronts in the state. But the idea here is to bring it back to the body that tried to bring some semblance of common sense this back in 1997, and the industry has greatly appreciated that, and I think neighbors have appreciated that. I think Mr. Reitz told me before this, they've only had 35 complaints in the last umpteen years. Galen can clarify that. But there isn't a big issue. These are national groups come in here trying to upset the compromise. So point number 3 on page number 3 is really the questions that we have for this board. Our first one of this committee is, does the legislature continue to support and stand behind this 3-part legislative compromise as it was intended and has been and continues to be enforced by the Pollution Control Agency for the last nearly 2 decades? Question number 2, if so, will the legislature clarify the scope of this 3-part legislative compromise so that it applies as it was intended and has been and continues to be enforced by the Pollution Control Agency for the last nearly 2 decades? And point number 4 is simply going through the laundry list of the clarifications. There is no intent in any of this by the author, I don't believe, and certainly not by Mr. Fitzsimmons or myself, to change the statute. We are simply trying to clarify what the legislative history suggests was the intent. The intent is that the standards that the legislature passed or forced the MPCA to pass in 1967, they mean something. That is the standard that we are to comply with. The livestock odor standards that were adopted in 1997, which adopted the hydrogen sulfide as a proxy, those mean something. If you comply with those, you're okay. If you're not, God bless you, you're in trouble. That's all we're trying to do. Those are 2 points of clarification. And with that said, if we have any more time left, if Mr. Fitzsimmons.
Yeah, my name's Paul Fitzsimmons. I'd like to thank the committee for the chance to speak. Just a quick little family background. I'm from a family of 9 siblings who are all in the business together out of Mapleton, Minnesota. So we all work in the production agriculture every day together. We own a company called Protein Sources. The background on that, it has about 280 employees. Most of them are in the livestock production phase, and those 280 employees really make up what is the fabric of southern Minnesota in our area, in all the small towns and communities across southern Minnesota. So I have a great commitment to the industry in which I make my living, and our family has made their living for the last 100 years. And that commitment is that we have always done what is best, not only for the environment, but for everything that we do to make sure that we are the standard for which other livestock industries that we're up against and compete. So we're committed to delivering the best product we can to our consumers, and also for the best product at a cost that everybody can afford. And so that's part of our commitment to this agriculture, to our livestock industry. But what we're talking about is it's not just an issue for pork producers, of which I'm one. It's an issue for all livestock feedlots across Minnesota. Our industry needs certainty. So in the past 10 years, I've helped permit facilities across Minnesota. And those permits take anywhere from a year to 2 years to get permitted as you go through townships, counties, and state regulations. And I think since 1997, when these rules were enacted, going all the way back to '82, our industry has been very, very proactive, working with the University of Minnesota, working with outside engineers, and a lot of the research that was done was actually funded by producers. And so we have found that we can, within the guidelines, we can run our industries and be very, very friendly. What we're asking here is, I probably have a couple more projects that are on the books. I don't think if we're going to go through nuisance suits after you've went through the 2 years of permitting and have never, ever went over the standards that are set, that I could really look somebody in the face and say Minnesota's the place to build. Because I think this is the new frontier for how animal agriculture is going to be attacked in Minnesota. So to fix this, and it's really not a fix. It was enacted by the both houses, and it's really just something to make sure that when the MPCA, when we get those stamps of approval of every one of those the township, the county, and the Minnesota state, that they do mean something, and that we're free to go and do our business, run our business, and in the communities where we're at, and supply those jobs for rural Minnesota. And that's really where we're at. But I can see this as a snowball effect if we don't get something done, because it's the new attack on animal agriculture in Minnesota.
Mr. Chair, can I ask him one question?
You sure can.
Mr. Fitzsimmons, I made the comment that I'm a lawyer, so I have no business making it, but the comment was that you guys cannot stay in compliance with these state standards during the removal time period, the necessary removal period in the fall, if you're not exempt. Is that correct or incorrect?
Yes, because the measurements are made at the property lines. So if we're applying on fields at the agronomic rates that we need to apply, we're going to be up next to the fence line of the neighbor. So there's absolutely no way that we would be able to comply. And again, that's not just pork producers, that's every animal industry that we're handling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fitzsimmons. Do we have any initial questions among the committee? All right, another testifier here. Would you please state your name for the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is David Preisler. I'm the Executive Director for the Minnesota Pork Producers Association. I just want to build on some of the comments from Mr. Fitzsimmons. Our organization is also, and our members are committed to compliance with state standards, and this bill doesn't change, again, state standards or enforcement. I want to take a brief moment, though, to talk about really kind of what's at risk here. If we look at Minnesota agriculture as a whole, generates, if we look at the last couple of years on a per year basis, generates about $21 billion for Minnesota's economy, so $21 billion. Of that, 40% of that $21 billion is directly from livestock. And so whether it's hogs or milk or cattle or turkeys, we happen to rank number 1 in turkeys in the U.S. We're number 2 in hogs, number 7 in dairy. And so overall, if we look at revenue that comes from livestock products, we're actually ranked 7th in the United States. And it employs people. And so as we look at that, there's well over 120,000 folks that are employed directly on farms or in our processing plants, and that doesn't even count the indirect employment and the support jobs. And I think one of the things that Mr. Fitzsimmons said that's really important is that if we're going to be subjected to this nuisance risk that is starting to become more common, it just really starts to make it difficult for people to make that decision to make an investment in Minnesota. Ironically, we've got our 2 neighboring states of North Dakota and South Dakota really trying to bend over backwards to figure out how they're going to attract livestock back to their states. For example, North Dakota has 90 dairy farms left in the whole state of North Dakota. They're going through a whole change in their corporate farm law to attract folks back. We're not asking for a change in corporate farm law. We're asking the ability of basically families here in Minnesota to be able to just basically do their business, be in compliance with state law, but then do their business, and not to have this risk hanging over them from a nuisance standpoint that you just really can't control. With that, I want to stay brief, and so thank you very much for your attention, and stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Preisler. Any initial questions among the committee?
Well, Mr. Chair and members, I know that I think Mr. Carlson wants to speak, and I've visited with him about it. We really are trying to drill down and get to that 21-day cleanout. A couple years back, members will remember that we passed through the Department of Agriculture some regulation for those applicators to try to make that as safe as possible. And for members from the rural area, you really realize that in the fall of the year, that fertilizer is like gold to those local farmers. And so I think this is a big deal. And so we're trying to shine some light on it, trying to find some common ground here. But obviously, we know we have a little work left to do. But I think that if Mr. Carlson would like to come, and anyone else that wants to testify certainly can. Or if you have questions for the members, you're welcome to do that too.
All right. Well, without any questions from the committee, if Mr. Carlson could approach the witness stand, please. And in the interest of time, if there's anyone else who would like to speak against this bill, Ms. Goodwin, you can approach the witness table as well. Mr. Carlson, if you could state your name for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Joel Carlson. I'm here on behalf of the Minnesota Association for Justice, and I appreciate my second visit to the Agriculture Committee this year.
Welcome back.
Thank you. As you know, our members represent people who are injured through the acts of others, and we do have lawyers that have been involved in a number of these cases. And our position is that this is not a clarification of the law, but is a pretty substantial departure from what the current law is as it relates to nuisance actions. And I've had a chance to share that with Senator Sparks, but our law defines in Chapter 561, defines a nuisance as anything that is injurious to your health, is indecent, offensive to your senses, or interferes with our use or comfortable enjoyment of our life. And a citizen or a company, many of these claims are brought by other companies, has a right to bring a nuisance action in Minnesota, and it's been the law for well over 100 years, to abate the nuisance. That's what most of these claims are about, is to try and abate the problem so that they can enjoy their property and live in harmony. There are two types of nuisances that are affected by the language, both a public nuisance, where the agency, whether it's a city, a county, or the state, would take an action to enforce an ordinance, or a private nuisance. Both are impacted by the language of the bill. We mostly are concerned about the private nuisance actions, and I think it's important to remember that it doesn't, to be a nuisance, it doesn't need to be an illegal activity that can interfere with your use and enjoyment of your property or injurious to your health. And I get the idea of compliance, but you need to know many of these are odor related, and Minnesota does not have an odor standard. We did have an odor standard at one point, and it was repealed by the MPCA in about 1998. So we don't really have an odor standard. We do have a hydrogen sulfide standard that they can monitor, but we don't have an odor standard. So being in compliance is great, but we don't have an odor standard either on-site or off-site that they can really measure this against. And so the last point I want to make, Mr. Chairman and members, is at least in 4 different places in the bill, this impacts and goes in and affects cases that are currently in litigation. If you look at the language, in the bill, for instance, on lines 2.4, it impacts a pending or future case. A pending or future case, it's listed 4 times. That is clearly a departure from where this legislature has been to go in and apply the law to a case that is currently being litigated. We have serious concerns not about that just in this bill, but as a precedential issue as well. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, and I know this is a sensitive issue, and communities want these operations to be successful. They also want to live in harmony with their neighbors, and that's really sometimes the only thing a nuisance action can do, is bring about an abatement. So appreciate your time, Mr. Chairman, and having the chance to speak to the author about the bill.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. In the interest of time, if we could go directly to your testimony, Ms. Goodwin, and if you don't mind, keep your remarks as brief as you possibly can. We're already over our time limit.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and committee, for hearing me today.
And if you can state your name for the record.
I'm Amy Goodwin.
Thank you.
I'm Amy Goodwin. I am a registered voter here in Minnesota. I currently live in in Douglas County. I used to live in Todd County. I am here today to speak against the Senate File 482. I'm speaking from the perspective of the people. I'm not supporting anyone, or I'm just here of my own accord today. So I thank you for hearing me. So our experience with facility farming started a couple of years ago, and we owned 33 acres in the county in which we lived. We had lived there all of our married lives. We had 4 children there, It was a beautiful wooded place in northern Minnesota, and we loved it. It was our dream home. When we first heard about this facility coming to our neighborhood, we were not against it. We didn't really know anything about agriculture or faculty farming, and we had been surrounded. We had two hog farmers that were within a mile of our home that had been there the entire time we lived there, almost 20 years, and a large dairy farm just down the road from our house. We coexisted with these agricultural farms our entire lives. My husband grew up on a dairy farm, so I just want to establish that we are in no way against agriculture. It's a big part of our lives in central Minnesota. So when we started to learn more about this facility, the size of it, the close proximity it was going to be to neighbors, we became concerned. And so we started to do a little bit of our own research. There are, just for your information, in our situation, there were 6 homes, families that reside within a half a mile of this facility. And the facility is a massive facility, 4,000 hog unit. And so that was our concern. And in my research, I came across many things that, were concerning to me. But the most concerning thing to me was the impact that the size of these facilities can have on somebody who is, particularly children, and who have respiratory issues or heart issues. I happen to have 2 sons with asthma, and I have asthma myself. And so this was a big concern for me. And so I became involved in actively trying to keep this facility out of our neighborhood. We started out trying to, really work with these owners. They were an Iowa-based business. They were coming to Minnesota by their own admission of not being able to raise healthy hogs in Iowa anymore. And my father-in-law, who is a well-established, well-known farmer in Todd County, even contacted them, said, hey, we have a lot of land in this area that people are not for miles. There's no water nearby. Let's check it out. We'll help you find a new place. But they were not compromising. So the bill went through after spending a lot of time, or not the bill, I'm sorry, but the CUP went through. And we didn't want to leave our home. We had lived in our home for 18 years. We'd raised all of our children there. Our children had, played out in the woods. That's where they grew up. That's where all their memories were. So we decided to wait and see what happened. So the animals were brought into the facility sometime the end of June, beginning of July. And we started noticing the effects on our youngest boy with asthma by August. And it was a very short time until he was completely dependent on his inhalers and steroid nebulizers to keep him breathing clearly. So by December, all of my children had developed a hacky cough, three of my 4 children, that they just couldn't get rid of. And it would be better when they were at school, but when they were at home, they were miserable. My sons with asthma were miserable. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but my son had such an episode with asthma that his lips turned blue and he couldn't breathe. It's a 20-minute ride to the hospital. And I'm sorry. After that, we stopped fighting to stay in our home because home was not a safe place for our son anymore. I'm sorry. So risking financial ruin, we put our house up for sale, and we moved. We bought a home and we moved, and we paid 2 mortgages for 7 months, which was a stress more than I can convey to you, but it was nothing compared to the concern that we had for our son, whose health has dramatically improved since we've been away from there. So I am here today speaking for the people, that there is 2 sides to every story. And the people have been hurt in this situation. And they say you should never show your enemy your weakness, but the truth is, they've really hurt us. They've not just hurt my family, but they've hurt several other families who are moving or struggling to stay. And if this bill passes, it will continue to hurt us, and it will hurt others like us. People who are Minnesota residents, people who are voters in Minnesota, people who love the place that we live. So this bill will hurt us. And we're asking that you do not pass it, that you stop it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Goodwin, for taking the time to share that story with us today. And I know Senator Sparks had mentioned earlier that he's committed to continue to work on this bill and take into account concerns that were raised today in committee. With that said, are there any questions around the table among board members or committee members? All right. With that,
I
Ms.
do
Goodwin.
have copies if anyone would want of my testimony.
Oh, very well. Okay, well, thank you for that. With time running out today, folks, we are going to move to close here. And with that said, we will. That completes the business for the day, and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.